My name is Liam Wickham, and I am the founder of game-production.com, where we seek to enable games industry professionals to plan better, lead better, and stop the crunch culture through building a community of support, knowledge, and training. Today, we are fortunate enough to have Callum Godfrey joining us from Oxford. Callum has been head of production at Bossa Studios for the last 6 months. You might know Bossa from Surgeon Simulator and I Am Bread. Before then, he was working for Wargaming Mobile as an exec producer, then head of studio at Wargaming Helsinki. Callum has worked at such esteemed gaming companies as King, EA, Microsoft, Playfish, Activision, and Codemasters. He has worked mainly, but not exclusively, within the mobile gaming space for the last decade. I met Callum at Wargaming, and he was a rock-solid, bullshit-free, highly passionate and talented producer. I am very excited and deeply honoured to be able to talk to him today and share his insights and passions with you all. Good afternoon, Mr. Callum Godfrey.
Good afternoon, Liam. It's a pleasure to speak to you.
It's a pleasure to speak to you again after all this time. I've just given a brief summary of somebody else's life, but do you want to have a go at it? Tell us your little bit of potted history and what you're up to at the moment.
Yeah, by all means. As you pointed out, I've worked for a bunch of different places for quite a number of years now. So in September, it'll be my 21st year in the industry. So it's almost old enough to legally drink in the United States now, my career. I think I've seen most, if not all, the different avenues and aspects of production over that time. You know, console, AAA, PC, indie studio, mobile in both big and small studios. Worked on titles that have made negative revenue, worked on titles that have made $1 billion in revenue, right? So you quite quickly realize that there is a lot of industry to see. It's a wonderful, rainbow, diverse, different place of different experiences for producers to gather. And honestly, I see this being the thing that I'm going to do until the day I die, which at this point in time feels like it might be any minute now with COVID. But you never know. Let's not tempt fate.
So that's interesting that what you said, not about dying, God bless you, but about the fact you've been in the game for 21 years. And I was, I got a couple of questions listed down here, but just to sort of jump around a little bit, I'm really interested for people who are new to the industry or who want to get into the industry. I don't think there's a great clear path to be a producer. When I look back at your background, it seems like you came in as a producer. How did you manage that?
Well, I got into production very early in my career, but I started actually in the traditional old school way back when you could apply to a games company that was near your house and become a game tester for the summer. I actually got into the industry sort of by accident. I think you and I have talked, Liam, about my old love of the rugby. I was on a rugby scholarship back in the day, but I got a knee injury. That took a little bit of time to heal, and I couldn't get insurance to play after that. So I ended up applying to Codemasters basically for a summer job back in the summer of '99. Got in the door there and never really looked back. I stayed in the testing department for less than 18 months in total, then kind of moved on to a little bit of level design, which then quickly led into leading a level design team for an expansion pack for a PC project. And then realized that leading teams is kind of where my strengths are. One of those guys who's not good at doing anything, but I can tell other people to do it pretty well. So became a producer.
I think that sums you up nicely, mate. So I agree with you. I think that your leadership skills, I saw them at Wargaming and I was very impressed. And I wonder, looking at just years and years of experience, it seems to be most of us who are leaders of teams and of groups and of visions and ideas and who try to lead with motivation and give momentum to teams and try and get us all somewhere and with morale high, etc. It seems to me like that does come, particularly within the games industry, from experience alone, without any real training or backing. Would you agree with that, or would you say otherwise?
No, I think so. I mean, I can't speak for everyone who is a producer in general, but I do know that for myself, the kind of people I work with who have been producers are they're natural problem solvers, right? They don't like seeing people's time and talent and energy go to waste. And that for me is one of my big drivers why I've been in production so long, is just wanting to see people get the most out of themselves, right? Like I've always had a deep love of video games. They go a long way back in my childhood. And I'm sure every producer you say will always do the I love games kind of thing. And for me, they literally saved my life. Without them, I would not be here because my dad was a horrible, abusive alcoholic son of a bitch, and they were my escape. So for me, being in games is wanting to give back as part of that. And I've always seen the way we make video games in this horrible, stark contrast of really passionate, talented people, frustrated and held back by their lack of ability to kind of collaborate, to get things done together, find a singular vision and move forwards against that. And production kind of comes in and, yes, it's a bit of a blunt instrument sometimes. It gives them that single vision to go behind it. It gives them that kind of unifying voice with which to talk and with which to think. And it really is, I know it's a horrible old metaphor, but it is that kind of, that's that hub at the center of the wheel around which all the spokes kind of are built. We are for good or bad, the center of everything, and ultimately responsible for everything. And honestly, I've seen game teams try and run without production before because they see it as an unnecessary overhead, or they kind of see it as a governance they don't necessarily need. And it doesn't really go as well. Like it doesn't work well. You need producers in place to make sure that teams are cohesive, are working efficiently, working effectively, and ultimately to measure the progress that they're making.
I suppose that's particularly true with the larger teams. You said you had experience with billion dollar games as well as tiny ones. And I wondered, do you think that's true of the smaller indies who may, say, be finding funding from a publisher and have an external producer looking after them? Do you think they still need that producer role supporting them if there's only a couple of people? I presume not.
I don't think they need it when it's a smaller number of people, right? When there's a smaller team, it's much easier to stay true to what the vision of the game is, to really agree between yourselves what you're supposed to be doing, making sure it gets done. But I do think if they're working with a publisher, they do need an external publishing producer who's working with them to make sure that the business interests of the publishing company are represented, especially in smaller indie devs where, for good reasons, you'll have one view of what the game could or should be. But you probably won't be that market aware, that really kind of clued in on what the public are looking for. I think that's what the publishing producer really brings in that mix. They bring that market expectation with them. Yeah,
that's a good point, isn't it? They've got it's not just about the due diligence, it's about telling you that during the history of making your game, you have to consider how it's going to be marketed, where it's going to get promoted, etc., and the hooks you need to be prepared for and the milestones that need to be in place that you need to meet in order to get your game out there and people talking about it before it's ready. That's a good point, rather than the leadership. And I guess just moving on from there, when I think about what you've said, the levels of production. So you started off it's amazing how many people started off in Cody's, isn't it?
I know, right? Back in the late 90s, it was a real breeding ground for a lot of the video heads and leadership and people we see kind of forging a path in the industry now.
Yeah, definitely. And so you've moved up the chain, so to speak, hierarchy, and I'm really very interested in this, the difference that a producer coming into the industry or somebody who's come in at the bottom, shall we say, as something like an associate producer, and maybe they come in from QA and they're now an associate or junior producer, and they're looking at the career path ahead of them. And I feel quite sorry for them because I look at it and go, it's kind of like, you're going out into a very large world in which you have to learn a lot in a lot of different areas because the role of production is so broad. But stepping back from there, looking at levels of seniority, I don't think that people are given necessarily a really good view of the different or what the different hierarchy might be, and of course it changes in different companies. But what's your experience been of the leap from, say, production when you first started to when you really had quite a few senior roles? What would you say the big differences in what you are expected to perform are?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It's a very confusing time for anyone who gets into production as a career path these days. Back when I started, the first step out of QA was kind of the design route or level design route into being an associate producer. But even now, right, if I look at my current expectations around getting into production, it kind of starts much more junior even than associate producer. We have roles now like production testers, people who are QA people who graduate into production purely to test or evaluate milestones so they come in for external parties, or to be that person who's playing the build because the other parts of the production team can't spend 8 hours a day, full working days in the game, keeping an eye on everything.
Yeah.
Then you kind of graduate onto a production coordinator role where you sort of put the testing to one side a little bit and you start helping more with some of the facilitation of making sure things like release management or communication with other stakeholders, the marketing department, the PR department, and so on. They start to become the production coordinator takes care of. By the time you move into an associate producer role, I'm expecting for that role those people to have a lot more kind of self-ability, self-awareness, and a lot more autonomy to be able to do things themselves without needing as much oversight or guidance. And Codemasters, you mentioned before, as a place to start, it was kind of a great size and scale of company in that it was big enough that you had some security blanket and some sort of safety around you in terms of other people with more experience, but also small enough that you kind of had to get your hands dirty on everything as an associate producer. You quickly learned a little bit of everything, enough to be dangerous, not enough to be proficient. And I think that's how I'd like the associate producer role to kind of be defined, right? You have to know just enough about every bit of game dev, a little bit how art works, a bit how tech works, a little bit how design works, to be able to kind of bring those people together and start really honing that skill set of being a collaborator, a facilitator, and essentially someone the team trusts and looks up to kind of have their best interests at heart. And honestly, the difference then between associate producer and senior and executive and head of is really just time, experience, and understanding when to apply different tricks and techniques from your toolkit to defeat whatever certain scenarios or challenges that your production team faces.
That was beautifully put, and I want to give you a hug right now. I think that was a lovely way of expressing it. Thank you.
No worries.
Just to follow through on a couple of things that you said, it's interesting looking at career paths. It's interesting that you just said, associate to producer to senior to exec to head of. And I've been thinking a lot about that recently. I've been thinking about career paths for producers, and I've been thinking about the advice that we can give producers. And when I look at the profiles of people that I'm going to be doing podcast interviews of, and I just think generally about my experience with producers, it seems to me like there's the good old, hello, I came from QA and I knew everything about a game. And then I asked if I could be a producer. And then I was one. And then I became a Scrum Master. Got Scrum Master training, and everybody told me to teach them how to do Agile. And then I was looking after teams. And then I was looking after more teams. And then I was looking after a whole game. And then I was scared shitless because I had to put the schedule together to make a game. I didn't really know how to. And then 10 years later, I'm running my own studio. And it seems to me like the production path is quite terrifying, but at the top, it's where. Now let me rephrase that. To get to the very top of the games industry, and when I say the top, I suppose what I really mean is to run your own company, or to be like you with head of production is an obvious one as a producer. But you can see producers who have gone on to be, say, senior dev directors and move up from exec producer to be handed a studio to look after, and then go on to form their own studio. And I wonder if there are many other roles in the games industry or many other disciplines in the games industry that give you that opportunity. What do you think?
Not as many, I don't think. I mean, production's become an increasingly nuanced thing over the years. As you'll know, Liam, from your career, back in the day when jumpers were goalposts, production was kind of like one size fits all thing. You were a producer, therefore you did the schedules, you did the budgets, you did the team line management in some cases, you did all these different things. And over time, as with many roles in the industry, actually, it's become a little bit more nuanced and more specialized. Nowadays you have producers who have more of a product management skill background, people who are much more driven by the KPIs and the live performance of their titles. You have some producers who are so specialist that they are just, focused on particular areas of game development. You have localization producers, you have content producers. I've worked with people who are live ops producers, right? A perfectly valid role, full-time hard piece of work.
Absolutely. And you mentioned delivery managers and the like as well. Yeah.
Exactly, right? There's all these kind of different areas. I think for anyone who's getting into production as a career path right now, in fact, I'm going through some reviews with some of my producers in my current job at the moment where I'm telling them this. Think about the kind of production path you want to be on. Like, what are your key skills? What really motivates you in production? Is it working with a team as someone who drives the schedule forwards? If so, maybe you're more of a development manager, sort of producer in that sense. If you're more of a kind of a team leader, the vision holder, the charismatic cheerleader for the team, maybe you are more of that kind of executive producer in that mold. And again, if you're more focused by the business results, making sure that the game is maximizing its revenue, making sure it's being super efficient with its expenditure, maybe you're more of a product manager, project manager, producer in that sense, right? Find what you really, really enjoy out of the very broad church that is production, and double down on it. Or conversely, take the odd career path that I've done where you kind of flip-flop back and forth between things, try and get a 360 rounded skill set. Takes you longer, but in some ways it's a better path, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've both flip-flopped. I've flipped and flopped outside and back into the industry a number of times, as you know. And when I look at this nuance that you're talking about, I've been thinking a lot as well recently about if you look at it as the spokes of a wheel, and in the middle you have the word producer. But these different spokes, if you look at where you have strengths and weaknesses, it is things like, well, okay, so project management and areas within project management, it's things like delivery of a product, possibly, especially in mobile, and your skills around that. It's about, like you said, about understanding how to run, say, maybe Scrum teams, if that's the thing that you're running with, or again, are you good at holding a vision? Are you good at are you maybe going to end up being the vision holder of a game? And I think it's interesting because as a producer, you get that choice, I think, leading forward. If you're any good at the general role of a producer, then you get the choice to specialize, which is great, right? It's, I mean, much like a programmer who's specializing in, say, AI, or a tech artist or something like that who can specialize. And I think that's great, but I still see then, because it's quite ambiguous, you may not know as a producer starting off what those different spokes actually even are, and how broad it is, and what the basic knowledge you should hold is.
Yeah.
And I think the imposter syndrome that I like going on about whenever anybody will listen to me, imposter syndrome is strong in the production world, because it's never really been defined. And the games industry is not one which says, let's have some professional tracks where we write down exactly what is expected of producers, etc. I remember when I was at PlayStation, and they had started trying that. They had started saying, well, if you're a coder, you actually don't have to become, or an engineer, you don't actually have to become a team lead in order for us to promote you and pay you more money. You can actually become a more specialized coder. You can become just better at what you're doing.
Yeah, principal in network, in rendering, etc. Yeah,
but it was quite a new thing, because back then it was all about, it was the very traditional management of promote somebody to be a team lead, promote somebody to then look after their department, or they couldn't get anywhere. And I think we're kind of going through that in production a little bit, where it can be fractured into so many different roles that you can't possibly cover it all as the gaming industry becomes more mature and more complicated. So I agree with what you were saying, but we're supposed to be talking to you, and I find myself talking too much. So apologies. But
I can listen to you talk for hours, Brent.
It's something I'm very interested and passionate about. Like, and I know you are. We both feel like people need more help and support, right?
Agreed. And I think both you and I, we got in at such a point where production wasn't as nuanced, right? It wasn't as much of a different divergent skill set or path you could take. So we've had the luxury of kind of learning all this organically as we've seen the industry grow and evolve around us. For anybody coming in now with all those different paths already kind of set out, it becomes much more difficult to have an opportunity to tread each of those paths and naturally learn that skill set. I honestly think it's a very confusing time right now for anybody who comes into production cold thinking they want to get into this, because it's so incredibly diversified now.
Yeah.
It's a bit of the old rose-tinted glasses, right? But I do think that the late 90s and early 2000s, before we started getting to the point where all games had online components, games suddenly became massive, complex beasts. We had hundreds of people on outsourcing teams doing bits of extra work for you, when it was really kind of self-contained, when you could make a AAA game with 35, 40 people, manageable team sizes inside companies. That was probably the best time to learn production overall as a craft. But I do think now the specialist opportunities just really give a fantastic range of different skill sets a chance to be producers. It's no longer this one mentality of, keep the team going, drive across the line, push, the old school brute force producer that used to be the kind of prevalent thing back in the day. Now you do have opportunities for people who are maybe more statistically or numerically minded, or more emotionally sensitive and aware producers to kind of come to the forefront, because the industry has evolved and changed beyond that old thing of producer is the person at the back of a team cracking the whip,
Yeah, that's absolutely, you're a very wise young man. And it reminds me of this, the last 10 years, there's been a lot of push in the industry about agile. And when you think about agile, you think about the servant leadership role, and the producers have kind of adopted that role as I said earlier. A lot of junior producers are just being given Scrum Master training and told to get on with it, which is both good and bad. But within that agile philosophy is that term servant leader, which I like, because I come from a teaching background, and I like the idea that you are guiding people to improve. And it's something that you said earlier as part of your head of production job now that you enjoy, right? Is that mentoring and the coaching and that you're trying to make something happen. And I was very moved by what you said about your dad. And I'm sorry that happened to you, but to have that as a stepping stone to be in a position where you're helping people so much now. I do think that's in a lot of people I meet who are producers. They sincerely want everybody to make the best game possible, and are to a lesser or greater extent obsessed about waste. and eradicating it, because you know when people are working on a game, how much content can get thrown out because producers haven't been planning things properly, or because an idea that wasn't fun gets destroyed.
Or because an idea that wasn't fun didn't have the right planning up front to ever fully realize fruition, and it gets cut because it was only 90% complete. You have those harsh cuts to make sometimes, which is super wasteful. In fact, those ones are the most, I think, demoralizing for the entire team at large. Everyone knows when something is fun. You really got to sit down and play it because we're all passionate people who like making and playing video games. When something's tantalizingly close to being really, really good and you have to cut it because schedule or budget tells you haven't got time to just develop it that little bit further, those are the most heartbreaking moments, I think, for me as a producer. The bits that the could have beens and should have beens.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess you've experienced quite a few of those because you've been around a while. And I'm really interested in how things are different with what you've been saying, how things differ between the mobile gaming industry and the video and PC. And it's something I'm a little bit obsessed about because, again, when you think about production and you talk to producers in, I could be wrong, right? But in my experience, producers in PC console kind of go, yeah, mobile gaming, whatever. And it's a different world, isn't it? Mobile gaming is more about the product. And we know I know from wargaming, and you know from lots of other experience, like say King, there's so much money swishing around just on things like user acquisition. Forget about making the game. Just you're going in to make a profitable product, right? So can you talk a little bit about that? Because you've been in the mobile industry since there was one, really.
So there's quite a lot of similarities and differences between console, AAA, PC, the kind of big budget productions, and the sort of smaller mobile space. And you're right, Liam. There are a bunch of people who in console and AAA look at mobile as being sort of an inferior platform, or the games are somehow lesser products. But actually, I find the opposite to be true. As part of doing mobile for the last 8-9 years of my career, I think I've become a much better, more rounded producer than I ever was in console and AAA space, because I have to think more about the end result. Like the games we put out essentially are free. So when you're asking players to go into those games and spend money, you're asking to make a value judgment based on the product you've made. Whereas with console and AAA, you're asking them to make a value proposition based on some cool, fancy marketing assets they've seen, right? You can really oversell that because the upfront transaction is where the costs happen. I actually really like the honesty you get in mobile games, where it's because you have to essentially convince users to play the game and then open their wallets afterwards, after you've shown them enough of a good time that they're willing to spend. There is a wonderful honesty to that. And I think that forces us as producers to really figure out, how do we make the best possible game in the time frame we have, to try and appeal to those users, rather than on console and PC, where you're often thinking about, how do we make a game that looks the flashiest, or it kind of can be turned into the coolest looking trailer. It's a bit less genuine for me, at least.
You're not going to spend 6 months or a year writing your own piece of middleware in mobile, are you? Just because you thought you could do an engine better, a video engine better, or something like that. You just got to get on with it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think mobile gaming actually is more about a truer user experience. The apps themselves are so easy to get into these days. They're actually a cleaner experience. You can't design a game where you can spend 8-hour sessions sitting down in front of a big screen with a surround sound, but the immersion factor is different. The engagement methodologies are different. And I think those constraints are actually where producers and designers and a bunch of other people in the industry really should thrive. It's the sort of console space where I think, because to follow from our point about inefficiencies, we've kind of become incredibly inefficient in console and PC because the hardware is so powerful now. And for the particularly successful AAA games, the budgets are so ridiculous for making games. We're talking development budgets in hundreds of millions for some of the biggest games on that scale, which basically means you've got time, freedom to do whatever you can or do whatever you like, even if the intrinsic value adds to the game is measurably almost zero, adds almost no quality, no discernible difference to the product. It can go in because there's a lot of inefficiency built in to try and help just overall make that quality level feel better.
I really agree with you, and I love the way you put that. I think, can you tell me more about, say, KPIs, measurable value, the data-driven decision-making that comes with mobile? Because I think people who haven't experienced that, they don't understand what that's like, how different that is for producers.
Sure. I mean, it's a very different mindset. Back when I first started in production, I don't think anybody would know what a KPI was in the video games industry. There was certainly no
a kind of chicken,
measurable way. Yeah, exactly. I think you think you'd eat after stumbling out of a club at 3 a.m. When was the first time I saw a KPI? Probably when I joined Playfish, and they were just starting to capitalize on that whole Facebook canvas gaming. Games as a service were just really, really taking off on Facebook as a platform then. And when we say KPIs, for anyone who hasn't encountered this, it's kind of key performance indicator is what it stands for, which is a very fancy way of basically saying, is it a good number or a bad number based around a bunch of different things you want to measure for the game health. Things like how many players are playing, how much money they're spending, how long they're spending in the game, all those kind of things. And as an industry now, we've gotten to a point where there are so many different KPIs that are kind of evolving or being added on a day-by-day basis. You almost need someone to be a centralized dictionary for these things, which might not be a bad thing for your site, Liam, keeping track of them. So, first-time producers can come in and they've got a place to go where they can understand what these things mean, and they're broken down in understandable terms for new faces.
I think there actually does exist one that I found, so I could point to that.
Good. I mean, even between companies, standard acronyms that I've heard are not the same, even though they're the same letters, same definitions between companies, right? So there's some subtle nuance in there. But it does change the way you think about building the games from the outset. You're very much aware when you're building a console and PC product that you spend a lot of time kind of finding the fun and iterating on that core experience because they're very metagame light, with the exception of some genres which naturally lend themselves to like RPGs and so on. But the real fun from a console and PC experience comes from the fact that people will spend multiple hours sitting down with a controller or mouse and keyboard in hand, having a really sort of lean in kind of experience with their product. For mobile, a lot more of the design thinking and the kind of the stickiness, the inherent sort of replayability comes from the fact that you kind of dip in for 5-10 minutes, you drop out. It's very much bite-sized gaming. And I think actually as we look at the landscape of how people are spending their time in the real world, we are much more fragmented these days. People spend a lot less time investing into one thing in particular, a lot more time diversifying into different interests. And mobile gaming fits really nicely around that. We are there when they want us, when the consumer wants us. They can put it in a pocket, leave it for an hour, come back for 5 minutes, never play again for 3 or 4 days, come back, and because the games are less complex, they don't have to spend ages reminding themselves what the control scheme was or where the story was, right? It's really easy to kind of put down and pick up again. And I think that is ultimately the key to a lot of what mobile has been really successful about. Whether the producers and the designers and the game teams realize it, they are basically building apps that fit around people's lifestyles, or the best games are certainly doing that. They're not trying to force or intrude their way into people's lives in a way that is disingenuous to the platform.
Yeah, that's very interesting, isn't it? I think if you look at the marketing that comes through and the research from places like App Annie, and you see then where mobile gaming's taking off, how long people spend playing a game, and the whole chat around like give them 20 minutes because that's what they've got. So what can you give them in 20 minutes, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's interesting to me that you're talking about something that's out there live, and almost immediately that a mobile game's out live, you're in a position, well, pre-live, where you can just be responding to data, right? You can be responding to the audience. You can be responding and changing things. And it's like just getting it out there live is the position where you go, oh, good, now we can actually put some real effort into the game.
Yeah.
Whereas, sorry, mate, go for it.
No, you're totally right. I mean, that is, I think, again, part of the honesty of mobile. People look down on it as an inferior platform, but I think the relationship we have with our customers on mobile is inherently much more honest than it is in console, because you are there using user feedback to make the game better for them. And yes, console and PC games will run beta tests, and they'll be open to sort of closed access for a little while, so people can kind of come in and help be part of a community, which is wonderful and great. But I think it's really the mobile games are leading the way on that. They're leading the way on understanding data, gathering it, using it in a way that is sort of self-serving, and that it ultimately makes a product that will ultimately make people more likely to spend within that product. But I don't think there's anything wrong with wanting to make a better game for whatever reason, whether it's to be better for its own sake or to make it a more monetizing opportunity. The end result is that we get a better game, and that means people will have a better time doing something with it.
But to play devil's advocate then, I remember hating mobile games and thinking they were just a complete waste of time, and the people who worked on mobile games obviously just didn't really understand about games making. They just wanted to do habit forming and addiction, and that was all based upon, I don't think that anymore, by the way, but that was all based upon having worked in the online gambling industry. And I was in there for a while. I was like a general manager and an operations manager, setting up the marketing side of things for a company that was based in Australia. And I got to know there how astute the gambling industry is at making you addicted, right? And it was around the same time where you could go to Amazon and you could start buying books which told you how to do habit forming and addiction forming behavior within video games. And of course, that when you have a way of just gambling online, and you know that the people designing these games have made them as addictive as possible, using all the latest cognitive theories, etc. They know exactly how to addict you. And I remember when I was working at Wargaming and seeing some of the games there that were being developed for mobile and thinking, you're doing the same thing. These big games, not just at Wargaming, sorry, but just the big top 10, top 20, whatever, they are so clever at addicting you. And I think I had a bit of a problem, a bit of an issue around it. And I think maybe if you look at how the person who is, say, doing some animations or doing some art or doing some code for a really big AAA video game, it's just a game, right? It's like you're not trying to get people addicted. Red Dead Redemption, you're not trying to get people addicted. You're trying to give them an amazing experience and so on and so forth. So I think there is that prejudice there. What do you think about that?
I mean, I think there's definitely an element to that, which is very true. And to your example with Red Dead, right? That's a game where you kind of get into that knowing what to expect. The marketing talks about it being this big, epic, sprawling experience. Storyline is a very key part of that. So once you've got your core pillars identified, and this again is a great production term, the kind of core pillars are essentially the things that you measure the game by at a very core level to the game itself. Red Dead Redemption, I don't argue its core pillars are things like, the story is a big part of it. The big expansive world, right? They're the kind of the key pillars that hold everything else the game is about. And on AAA and console, you get into defining those very, very early, because they're essentially what you build the entire vision and the brand around.
Yeah.
And I do like that with the kind of upfront transaction model, you have to sell those pillars to people. The players are then making a value choice on, well, this game has these kind of things that I might be interested in, the genre, the setting, the gameplay mechanics, and so on. Do I think that's worth me dropping my 50, 60 pounds in the store to buy? And it's a very honest transaction in that sense. However, once it's done, it's done. I can't tell you how many times I've bought a game where I feel like I've been cheated by that. I've bought a game and I think, I wish I'd never played this. It feels like the marketing was disingenuous.
Well, you can compare it to watching a film trailer and then going and seeing the film and going, well, hang on, that's not what I thought I was going to see.
Yeah.
Too late.
Exactly, right. Exactly. Once you've paid your money, you kind of just sit there and you bear it, right? And mobile free-to-play doesn't have that problem. But we do certainly see some of the same patterns now occurring, particularly, as you say, around things like compulsion and creating those loops, right, where players are given that dopamine hit every so often to keep them coming back and doing things. And I think we can actually look back over history of console and PC games and see the modern ones have taken cues from that. If I think about the sort of mission structure in say, a game like a GTA back in the days of sort of PlayStation 2 when that really took off, those short 5 to 10 minute missions that you're playing in a GTA, they're perfectly designed to be that kind of regular hit of dopamine, that regular hit of progression, that regular feeling of like, holy crap, I've done something good, which does form psychological addiction for players. It does keep them coming back. I think we discount how much those things kind of subtly affected not just mobile games, where it is much more overt, I totally grant you, but they've crept into all parts of the video games industry now. And I think actually mobile gaming now is the one where I see the push back against that. Certainly not, maybe not in terms of the big companies, the kind of the ones who are making the match 3 games that have a very almost fruit machine-esque feel to them. But I think for some of the ones now who are looking to get into the industry or are starting to sort of see some successes, they're looking at giving players more of a long-term feeling, more of an investment they can kind of hold on to. less about that short-term, immediate gambling fix, I guess, and moving more into being somewhere in between the mobile games of old and the console games of today. I actually think, as a sort of exercise in theory, if you'll indulge me for a second, is that in maybe 10, 15 years, players won't actually recognize the difference between console and mobile games anyway. The hardware on mobile is getting so much better all the time. The internet technologies now allow for streaming to become a really regular occurrence. I don't see any reason why players won't, in a decade and a half, basically have a number of different devices where they play the same comparable gameplay experience. And the onus is on us as game makers to figure out how we tailor that experience depending on which screen version of the same game they're playing, whether they're playing on the console version, where it can be much more story-driven, much more engaging controls. They take their phone out when they go out for dinner with friends or go and see a film, and they're playing the phone version of the game, which is a slightly lightweight or different interaction model entirely, but it's still in the same game ecosystem. I think I see that being where the industry and production is starting to take us.
Yeah, they tried it a few times, haven't they, where the mobile tends to give you like the view of the meta game and to actually see what's going on the ground, you fire up your console or something like that. Yeah, and it's been very interesting. Now, I agree with you. I think the crossover is great. Well, I don't think the crossover is great. I think the crossover is very interesting, and I think all across the games industry, as you are implying, and going back to your point about production needing to become specialized at some point, or you as a producer need to become specialized. The games industry is becoming so complex and complicated and huge. I think you can still be your indie teams making small games, etc. But as soon as you get above a certain size, you've entered a whole new world. And I think when we were making games out of coal and all that, you could make a game, you could ship it, and off it went, and you would sell it, and people would buy it, and great. Then now it's almost ambiguous what going live can mean in some cases for games from whatever platform, be they mobile, be they console, PC, etc. Because a game it grows, it becomes alive like a baby becoming a child, and you sort of grow an alpha audience, don't you? You maybe use Steam, for example, to get some people backing you and trying your game out, and then you become bigger and bigger, and you go through the different phases now until you're handing over to live ops. But it seems to me like more and more games are going to be putting this sort of almost like a lean startup version of a game up, or maybe they should, where they chuck a game in front of people as soon as they can, and then from there they build it up into what it could be. And I think mobiles champion that, and I think people are trying to get their heads around that with some of game development elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, you'll know the term MVP, right? It's a fairly common one that people in production throw around all the time. But I think mobile is definitely more of a champion of that. I think in console, we have had a history of looking at projects and going, oh, well, it can't ship without all 50 features on this tick list. Whereas actually it could probably ship with 10 of those and 5 of them half done, 3 of them not even considered yet. And just to start getting some early feedback around things, we have a tendency to not want to, I guess, reveal things too early for fear of the whole package being so intrinsically interwoven. Design feature A needs 15 other features to support it, or it doesn't meet design A's ambition. And I think the games have become a little bit overly complex in times. Some of the best games out there, I think, could be done in a much more simple way. And this is where I think mobile really shines: the ability to get products into the hands of the customers much, much sooner than you can on a console or a PC. In a way that is more just inherently part of their lifestyle, right? It's more easy for them to accept it into their lives.
Mate, I think we could talk about that particular topic for a very long time. I mean,
we probably could.
As soon as you start talking about, because what you're really talking about there is agile product development, right? Where you're looking at maybe a short discovery phase, but basically trying to get a working piece of software, in this case a game product, out in front of people as soon as possible to get their feedback. And of course
and then actually allowing feedback to be fed back into the backlog. Of course, having feedback and not actioning it is a waste of everybody's time.
And is the biggest crime across not just the games industry, but everywhere else too. How to handle your feature requests that come in and how you value things. And it's quite stunning how difficult it is to convince people they should be putting value to feedback and they should be putting value to what they're working on. And then they should be using some pretty standard development methods to order the work that they're doing, et cetera, et cetera. But this agile development, this idea that you get something out in front of people as soon as possible, I think mobile's nailed that. And I think really you can get into mobile gaming from standard mobile software development. You can move across if you're a developer and you won't really notice much changing, right? But I think for a producer, like if I was to step across from game production as a normal, say, console producer, and I stepped across into the world of mobile, I think I would be pretty terrified because suddenly I'd become a product owner. I'd become a product manager. And can you tell us a little bit about what's different?
I'm really glad.
Sorry, mate.
Yeah, I'm really glad to hear you say that, because we've kind of alluded a couple of times to Scrum and Agile best practices and that being a framework for which to work within. And I do think good producers should have a real understanding of how things like the Scrum Master role work, and in fact are often required to be the Scrum Master on their teams. However, I think I look at the producer role generally as more aligned to a product owner role, or sort of that product owner function in the Scrum framework, where they kind of are the person who's bringing it all together and has to understand at a fundamental level everything that is going into making up the bigger picture product at the end of the day. For the teams I'm coaching and mentoring at the moment, we're looking to bring product owner training in by default. It's actually quite astounding to me how often I speak to producers or I work with producers where the formalized investment in kind of the craft or the hard skills of production has kind of drifted away now. I don't see many producers organically thinking, I'm a product owner, I do own products, because they do. They are responsible for its success, therefore they own that thing. And I would love to see more of a shift towards that as a thinking point for production in general. The product owner skill set I think there's kind of confusion where we look at product owner, and because we have roles that have product in the title, we kind of assume, that's product manager or head of product who's the product owner. No, not at all. I mean, sometimes, yes, it will be. But I think having the skills that a product owner role brings, i.e. someone who can look at the big picture, can hold the vision, can bring the different stakeholders to talk about the product, can help prioritize a backlog and find that thing that really matters to the customer as early as possible, get that in front of them, listen to feedback and take that feedback back into the backlog. That, for me, is really what the producer and product owner or producer as product owner is really exemplified.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I think, unfortunately, there's going to be some people listening to this who go, what the hell are they talking about? Because if you come from the other world, if you will, of being a producer on a game, you're exposed to project management and you're exposed to stakeholder management and you're exposed to, say, some risk management. But basically what you're doing is quite different to treating that game as a product. And in mobile, it's big data. Yeah. Big data, it's measurable, it's, as we're saying, it's get it in front of the customer, et cetera, et cetera. These are all agile-based philosophies. They might not be agile in total, but the philosophy is agile, that philosophy of a product owner and a product manager, right? Which are kind of interrelated titles. It depends upon how they're interpreted. But these are jobs in which, it's the 3 V's of vision, value, and validation, where you go in and you go, okay, so what's the vision for this game? Okay, so how are we going to bring value fastest? Okay, how are we going to validate that what we've done brings value? And those principles, that way of thinking, that philosophy, that's not something that most game producers outside of mobile are going to be really familiar with. And I think it's a bit of a shock when you meet a product manager and go, holy shit, they're speaking in a different language. And I think crossing those boundaries is difficult 100%. In both directions. Sorry, mate.
Yeah, and I can't actually keep track of how many times on console and PC. I mean, it's not very many actually. The number of times where there was an upfront attempt to try and validate that a prototype we'd built was good with a non-biased audience, i.e. some customers. The number of green light meetings I sat in for some of the biggest companies in the world in our industry, where whether the game got moved forwards or didn't get moved forwards was basically a collection of 4 or 5 people who, with the greatest respect to them, aren't really that savvy on how to make games. There's a lot of business people making decisions around whether a game should get the next $10-15 million of funding to go to the next stage. Whereas the whole MVP, getting it out to the hands of the public process is, again, much more honest than the console and PC traditional processes, where it is about letting the users tell you if you've got something that's worth considering or continuing with. And I think this comes back again to a point we made earlier, Liam, which is on console and PC games, as much as I love them, you can sell people a bit of a lie through the marketing, through making glitzy trailers, through making really glamorous development diaries and so on, because you're expecting people to make that initial transaction based on a thing they haven't actually held in their hands yet, based on a promise that you're making with them. Whereas in mobile, they don't spend until you've delivered on the promise, and I love that relationship.
It's probably very it's an interesting contemplation that on mobile, an enormous amount of money goes on user acquisition, on discovery, on right.
An order of magnitude greater than the amount you spend on making the game, without a doubt.
We know that for a while now, there's been $100 million marketing campaigns for big games on console, for example, and PC. But still, the discussion around spending money, budgets, etc., within PC console will remain around wages and that sort of stuff, right? Whereas in mobile, it's like your teams just aren't that huge compared to the volume of product that you can get out in a short amount of time, right?
Yeah, I totally agree. And for all the people who are in console and PC space and they think about innovation on platforms, they probably think that they're where innovation happens because they're pushing, the rendering technology, or this amazing new bit of incredible AI software they've written that makes, blinking of an eye when the AI sees a flash of light, these kind of subtle things. But actually, I look at innovation very differently. I look at it in terms of ways to appeal to users, innovation in terms of finding entirely new ways to use the piece of hardware. Pokemon Go being a great example, because those innovations that make the game instantly a thing that players can go, oh, that's cool, that's different. You haven't got to play the game to experience it. Those drive your UA costs down. They make the game acquisition of users much cheaper because organic word of mouth is much more of a thing. And that's really important on mobile because, as you say, the spiraling UA costs mean that it's incredibly difficult for a good game sometimes to get the kind of coverage and traction it deserves, because you have to spend to be front of mind and make sure that people understand what your product is and that it's there. But I think with mobile as well now, we are starting to see perhaps some green shoots or signs that the audience is getting a little bit more aware of some of the dirty UA tactics that have been pervading for the last 2 to 3 years, with UA adverts on things like Facebook or Instagram or other social media platforms, where the advert you look at, you go, that's kind of interesting. Then you get to the App Store and go, that's not the game you're selling me. Those click-through rates, again, another key KPI we measure, are now starting to drop down, and we're starting to see players resisting the false advertising that has crept into mobile a little bit as well, because that honesty just isn't there. That transactional relationship with the user has become a dishonest.
But I think to flip this on its head, I suppose when you are so data-driven, when you are so much of product management, when you are in terms of a methodology and approach, I think the games can reflect that as well. And I think a lot of the big games are about the data, and they're about the grind, and you're just buying to get past grind. And I think, I don't play mobile games. I don't like them. I haven't found ones. I'm talking about the big games. I haven't really found any of those that I like, because they just annoy me. After a couple of days of being told to do something, I'm like, no, fuck off. I don't want to do it. Why should I? I want to do something interesting. But by that time, I've been trounced because I've gone, my empire's gone public or something, and I've suddenly found myself destroyed by the next door neighbor who's spending 12 hours a day on it. And I'm like, this isn't really fun, is it? Now, I know that's an exaggerated example, but the same was true of some of the Facebook games. You get, when you've got a lot of data, when you've got audiences of millions available, and you can trial A/B testing and this sort of thing, I think you have to be careful that your game doesn't become about maths. And I suppose that's something where when you play God of War, you're not really thinking about the maths. I know you can be with a lot of RPGs these days, but you know what I mean, right? And strategy games. But I think that's something which I personally don't really like. And I suppose that's possibly because of that data-driven approach, right?
For sure, man. And you'll hear a lot of product managers and heads of product functions talk about optimizing the game economy and optimizing the socio-economy of the player base as well, trying to find that sweet spot between players being just frustrated enough that they'll spend some money versus too frustrated that they won't spend some money, or finding ways for encouraging the players to stay in game longer so they can kind of keep the liquidity of the matchmaking pool up, so you've got more players to beat up, like your example of the game where your empire went public and people could then come and invade you. The game economy needs people who are not going to play anymore because they're just there to get beaten up by others, right? That otherwise people who are spending money have nobody to lord it over with their financial investment. You start building up these incredibly complex socio-demographic kind of ecosystems where you categorize players based on their play type, their play behavior, their spending type. And I think the best games commercially have found ways to appeal to a very broad and a very, I guess, compounded, in some senses, set of those players. Like King's Candy Crush game, for example, is a really good one where it has hundreds of millions of monthly active users. MAU, another good KPI. So, I think when I was working at King, we peaked at around 370 million monthly active users playing Candy Crush. That's bigger than the population of the United States of America was, if I remember correctly. And only 2 or 3% of those players would actually spend money in the game. But even because it's such a big scale of the game, 300 million plus monthly active users, you get 2 or 3% of them spending. That's still millions of players who are opening their wallets every month and spending, upwards of $5, $10, $15 here or there. And you quite quickly get to a point where that soon adds up. Candy Crush is a multi-billion-dollar franchise, and it just baffles me that you can have 97% of the playing base probably enjoying the game more than the 2 or 3% who've spent that money, playing it for free, with it being supported by the 2 or 3% who are willing to pay. And honestly, I do think there is going to be a shift in the industry towards more of a sort of evening out in terms of that payer and non-payer mechanic, where finding ways not just to encourage non-payers to what we call convert into being payers, but finding ways for the people who have paid to get more than just that kind of that cheap thrill value out of having spent money in the game, that silly cosmetic. I think there's got to be a deeper connection for the players who are willing to spend money, which goes beyond just the superficial stuff that we've done in games so far.
It's really interesting, isn't it? Because the more you talk, the more I think mobile gaming, it's people who work in mobile gaming can find a job in software development making mobile apps, right?
Sure.
You can skip straight across. And you can't do that as a producer for PC and console. You just can't. Whether you're an internal or external producer, you can't just skip over to say, hey, I'm going to be a producer because that role doesn't exist.
Yeah,
over in mobile, it does exist. Now, this isn't a complete tangent from what you were saying. What I was thinking is of something like the mobile games themselves and what they're using this big data and what you've just described in terms of the whales, etc., and those terms we're not supposed to use anymore, of how the few fund the many. That's something which even I remember getting an email yesterday from Strava, the fitness tracking app. And it was the co-founders were emailing out and saying, we've decided to put some of our features behind the paywall to reward people who are paying us and to move some of them out of the free. But don't worry, the free offering will still be great. And you can see that tendency now towards people who are paying going, well, hang on, can we get more, please? And I think we both grew up around the internet in which you used to have to pay for things.
Yeah.
And then everything became the free model. It was freemium, right? Mm-hmm. And I think, well, not that I think, but you can see it now. That change that you're describing, I think that will become a broader change. However, I do think with mobile, there are so many new audience areas demographically to still tap and geographically to still tap, like the Indian audience, for example, that you can go through the same thing. The African audience, the people who haven't what's the word? They haven't got fatigue. And that's the same as any multinational going across different countries, creaming the profit of people until they realize what's going on.
Agreed. And actually, there's an area of monetization we haven't even touched upon, which is very much a mobile flavor of the month, which is advertising. The advertising spaces that you sell in game, where you basically have a bit of UI that you can put an advert inside, and then every time that appears on a screen, an impression is tracked, and some lucky company at the back end goes, cool, 10 million people saw my t-shirt advert running in game X. We can generate decent sums of revenue that way. Some of the biggest mobile games out there, King being a good example, there's no reason why they can't be $1 billion advertising platform with the network size that they have. And I think that again is another interesting and potentially very lucrative avenue that we can go to start offsetting some of these costs that we've talked about, where we kind of maximize the spend against whales. I see that as potentially a way to try and even out the distribution of the financial burden for keeping the games going on a small percentage of the users, and having everybody pick up some of that financial strain through being essentially sponsored content.
Hmm. Do you think that the mobile gaming industry is simply going to get bigger and bigger and bigger, almost logarithmically, or do you think it's already plateaued to the top few making the most money?
Good question. I mean, I kind of see the industry always getting bigger because phones are getting better all the time. People have more access to them. Human population is increasing for another thing, right? And every year there's another however many 100 million population growth. And people will pick up mobile phones. They are an essential part of modern day-to-day life. So I see that industry growing, certainly at a much faster pace than, say, console and PC does, because the barrier to entry is much lower. That said, I don't see it growing at the same explosive pace that it has done. I think it is going to keep growing at pace because of the sheer scale of the industry and the number of people coming into it. But I don't think that it's going to see the same sort of correlative effect for the games industry. In fact, I think, if anything, the big games now are proving that they're having to work harder and harder and harder to stay the big games. Some good examples being Machine Zone and their 4X strategy games, the Game of Wars and so on. Where when they decided to stop pumping billions of dollars into UA, despite being known as the best in their field, they kind of fell out of the top 50 grossing. In fact, I don't think they're even inside the top 100 grossing games anymore.
UA being user acquisition, right?
User acquisition, exactly, sir. Where once you stop spending to bring those users in, people didn't want to play the product. And I think that's kind of an interesting inflection point for our industry. When those big kind of billion-dollar franchises like this stop investing that kind of money to keep topping up the funnel, the game kind of fell apart. Their entire ecosystem for the users fell apart, which is very interesting as a case study and a thing that we as a broader industry could and should be learning from, around how we have to try and treat our users not just as this kind of cattle that we can bring in for financial slaughter, but actually trying to keep them in the game for longer and making sure that there's actually a real, tangible, meaningful reason to stick around and play the game beyond just the sort of the financial transaction interactions we as game businesses want them to have.
And I think that's a great example of why some people don't want to become gaming professionals in the mobile gaming industry, because they want to make what they would consider more pure games that aren't just about making cash every hour, but are about making a game, getting it out there, maybe doing DLC, but basically, seeing it packaged and seeing it being played and seeing people going, wow, as opposed to, I just need to log in and build another farm and to be facetious. But it's interesting, isn't it? It's interesting because you of course, especially you've been able to see probably a helicopter view of all of this because of your positions. And I noted that you've been head of studio, head of production, you've been program manager. What does a program manager do, by the way? Good
question. So again, another one of those wonderful distinctions between different roles as production being a very broad umbrella. Program manager, when I was working at Microsoft, was kind of like project manager who managed multiple projects simultaneously. So I was managing, I think it was 4 out of the 8 different development teams over at a Microsoft studio. I want to say managing, basically sorting out their schedules, making sure the delivery was on time, making sure they were hitting quality. So again, in other companies, that would be called a producer. The producers at this particular studio, their role was very different. They were more like design interface in the sense that they were trying to make sure that the game quality was really well understood, and were working much more closely with the designers than, say, I was. But again, my teams, I was responsible for the quality. Just I happened to be working on teams that didn't have designers, because it was making sure that the art team were delivering, making sure that the central technology team were delivering. So didn't get the title producer, but in that company, but it was very much the production skill set, schedule, budget, team management, making sure things were delivered. And ultimately, I think we haven't really talked about much actually, Liam, communication, making sure stakeholder management was well managed and maintained. And as soon as there were things going wrong, the right communication channels were used and people were informed of what this was. And we kind of collectively then came together to fix those problems.
when you listen to any GDC talks from producers talking about being a producer, when they break down the categories of what it means to be a producer, communication always comes out as the top one.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting. If I listen to you talk, I'm basking in your golden words going, wow, this guy, he can really express himself beautifully. I'm sure the audience would agree. So can you imagine being a producer who can't communicate well? Because I can't imagine that.
I think inherently, if you can't communicate well, you're not well suited to be in game production. It is a natural facilitation role where sometimes you'll be required to stand in a room and be the person who's kind of championing something and standing up, talking with fire and brimstone about why something's going to be awesome. Sometimes communication is the ability to just shut your mouth and listen, right? Communication is not all about expressing your own opinions. It's about taking feedback in. And this is where I think that product owner part of production kind of really kicks in when you're, listening to either direct feedback from your customers in a playtest session, or you're listening to them via a piece of data or a piece of analysis that's been done where they're saying they're voting with their actions in game, essentially. Communication is, I think, communication and common sense are probably the two most useful skills for producers. And I essentially see common sense as the practical application of things you learned during communication.
That's interesting. I would see common sense as the ability to see obvious things that other people are too busy and blinkered, therefore, to see. But you've got the opportunity. If you're good at listening and you're good at watching, I think as a producer, you have that opportunity that others simply are too busy to have, to go, well, hang on. What do you mean you just saw that thing over there was broken and those people over there are working on X and not Y? And you have that opportunity, right? And then it's your responsibility. You're accountable to say, I'm going to do something about that. And the way you do something about that, again, I think shines through if you're a good communicator.
Agreed.
Because then you're not going to just start yelling and shouting at people, the old-fashioned exec producers who would shot people in toilets or flush their heads down them or something. But you're going to try and do something far more mature, hopefully.
One hopes. I mean, I think the dark days... Certainly, I haven't heard any stories about this for a long time of the kind of the producers and the executive producers who were those kind of slightly terrifying, aggressive behemoths that would intimidate and get things done through fear. I think the days of our industry having those characters around are long gone, or where they still exist, those characters are kind of birds of a feather flocked together, and they don't really happen so much in the industry as you and I would know and love it now.
Yeah, I think. I mean, that's one thing. If you're listening to this thinking, "Holy shit," I was thinking maybe I could become a producer, but now I'm not so sure. One thing you should know is that I think the games industry has matured, and because of money, frankly, because now you have to be more aware of things like law. The employment law. You have to be more aware of what you can and can't do, the behaviours that are appropriate. Whereas previously, 10 years ago. It was much more of a cowboy, a white male cowboy state than it is now. And I think because we're seeing students graduating into the games industry, I think it comes with men, women, and just their knowledge, their experience, their passion. They've got a little bit of foundation background. They've got a little bit of confidence. And I think that's changed the games industry enormously. That people are coming in. I mean, I've worked with some at Sumo Digital who had graduated from universities in the northern Viking lands, and they were exceptional because they had been taught very, very well, and it had given them a lot of confidence to be able to express what they thought in things like game design. And they were really sharp, and I thought, well, this is great. This is the future. This is that us old bastards aren't going to be needed much anymore if they can do what it seems they can do. But I do think the world is changing in the games industry, but you have to be aware that you're coming into a place in which companies are going bust. You can get sacked. You'll probably end up having to move around a lot, and you may or may not get a bonus if your game gets big. But really, it's all about the money, isn't it?
Very much so. Very much so. And there are pros and cons to that, of course. Yeah, I think the pros that you've stated very, very articulately there, that it is making us all grow up. It's making us behave like a regular industry. The cons are that it's making us all grow up. It's making us behave. As much as it's become a much cleaner, safer, more sanitized place to work, I think some of the opportunity for us to be a bit more freeform, to figure out different ways of doing things. I think some of that's become a little bit too standardized, too sanitized. There's almost by rote ways of learning, and by making video games now, you can almost consider it an end-to-end process where you can apply 90% of the same methodologies to most projects, and probably get a lot of the same end results. I think the real superstar producers that I've worked with over the last few years, they find ways to inject a bit of their own personality and their own kind of flavor into doing production, rather than it just being a templated process they bring everywhere now. That really is, I think, where you find the producers where when their team looks at them, they go, I'd crawl through broken glass with my fly undone for that person, versus the I'll just come to work and do my job response.
That was a really extreme example, by the way, of what you would do for a person. Thank you for using that.
Yeah. Yeah, I've still got the scars, by the way.
So can I ask you, I want to just ask you some random questions now, right?
Yeah, go for it. Rapid fire round.
Spot questions, rapid fire round. So what did the head of studio in Helsinki job entail?
Good question, actually. I mean, you talked a little bit before about game producers going on to becoming heads of studio, and that's actually a very interesting and diverse role in its own right. What I was doing there was essentially doing a lot of the studio facilitation and management, i.e. making sure we had the right people in the teams.
Coffee.
Actually ordering the coffee sometimes as well. I'd say I actually made a big failing in not investing more in support structure around me to take care of some of the day-to-day stuff, like ordering the coffee and making sure the lights and the bills got paid. I took a lot of that stuff on. But I think the key role of what I was doing there really was trying to make sure that the interface between the Helsinki studio, which was a satellite studio for wargaming, and the bigger parent company Wargaming was well maintained, make sure that relationship was solid and strong, while being kind of executive producer on a couple of games in the Helsinki studio, making sure that they were well understood, they had a really good product understanding, and then just trying to empower the design team and the code team and the art team to deliver against those games. I mean, that was kind of the dream for the role. It didn't really manifest in that way sometimes because, big companies and sort of the interesting challenge of making sure that your studio is profitable versus other studios where the company could spend its money and so on, can sometimes become a less than fun consideration for someone who's running their own studio.
Were you running your own studio? Because just for people who don't know, the Helsinki studio, Wargaming Helsinki, pretty much that was an independent studio that Wargaming had recently purchased, right? They'd bought it and wrapping it into their umbrella of
it was an indie studio that was acquired as part of Wargaming Mobile's growth and expansion strategy. I'd say I was running my own studio there in so much as everything we did in the studio, I had ultimate control over. Well, not control, because that makes it sound like I'm a dictator, but I could say yes or no to it, but usually it would be more of a collaborative decision with the guys in the studio. It was like being an indie studio, but basically having the funding from Wargaming, where we chose the games we made, we chose how we make them. We had a lot of opportunity to try and do interesting, cool, challenging things for ourselves. But at the end of the day, we were one of many satellite studios Wargaming had, and Helsinki was not a cheap place to have a studio. And I totally agree with the decision they made to close that studio down end of last year. As much as it sucked at the time for myself and all my colleagues, part of what my responsibility as a studio head was to make sure that we were working lean, working in a smart way, and could justify our cost. And compared to the other studios, we were just more expensive and therefore a bit of an outlier. I think that's ultimately one of the key things you have to do as a studio head is be willing sometimes to carry the can when the shit comes falling down.
Yeah, and as we said, it's about money. We're fortunate in the games industry that a bunch of people can just stay where they are, having fun, making games, hopefully, and just get on with it. And go in, do their art, do their code, do their design, do their QA, do their audio, whatever. Some of us have that need, that drive to sort of go, no, we're going to make this better, right? I want to get promoted. I want to move up. And of course, you've moved up from senior to exec producer while you were at Wargaming. And to me, that was a kind of semi-external producer role in which you were trying to help other studios, right, that we were purchasing. And you were also a producer amongst product managers, which was like a hawk among doves. And that part there, how did that work? Because and just to be clear to people, so Callum's title was I think exec producer in the end, wasn't it?
Yeah.
you were working with people there on mobile gaming who were called product managers. So what was the relationship like there?
I mean, that's a really interesting one to try and address, actually, because product managers, that they serve a really useful function in especially mobile gaming, where you have data coming in, and you're trying to make the right call based on the data you have, but also trying to build game design systems or build systems into games that will get you better KPIs or metrics later on. A good example being, if you're going to build a guild system, you copy Game X because Game X has the best guild system in the industry. You kind of look at those things and you figure out the value those individual features add and try and find ways to make that fit inside your game. Working with product managers was kind of interesting in that a lot of product managers, I find, and no disrespect to them as a role, I think it's a vital role, don't really know how to make games. It's quite a new role for our industry. And they're very used to working in sort of live operations or working in games that are in their beta stage. So they're kind of essentially finished or formed products at that point where they can come in and they can make a tweak and a change to them. They didn't really have much of a clue how to take a game from a piece of paper concept through to actually being a thing you could then start to tweak. I think that's one of the key differences between production or producers and the product manager role, is the understanding of what it takes to build a product, not just to shape one after it's been built.
So who builds it in the mobile gaming industry? Who builds it from scratch?
Well, yeah, ultimately that's why producers still exist. As you'll know, Liam, from our time over in wargaming, there was only one producer in the office, and that was me working on multiple titles. And that only really worked because the game producers in the studios themselves were all very talented and very competent and able to do a lot of the sort of production work autonomously. I honestly think if Wargaming Mobile had invested in a couple more producers in its sort of centralized publishing function, we would have been in a better place overall. We'd have got to better end results much, much sooner, just because there's more visibility, more objectivity, and we're not just putting the onus for the kind of games we make on product managers who only care about the end result, bottom line KPIs. We've had more of a game development view in that mix as well, rather than just the sheer financials.
Yeah, I mean, from my experience of product managers, they're a bit like, it's a bit like they're on a chariot whipping the horses, going, go, go, come on, let's go, we're nearly at the finish line, go, go, go. Mm-hmm. So how was that different at King, let's say? Who was making the games? Who was creating? Who was doing that?
So King was actually similar and different. Similarities were very much that we had product managers, although we called them business performance managers at King. And the game teams still had a lot of autonomy to figure out the kind of games they wanted to make. But I think at King, if I remember correctly, the onus up front before you even greenlit a game, there was a much stronger greenlighting process. You had to do a lot more market research to identify an opportunity than we had to at Wargaming to get a game even started. And I think doing that, the sort of the producers that I was working with, in fact, I was one of them at King trying to get games greenlit. We became almost the product managers for that initial prototyping and pre-production phase. And then when the game moved into the production phase, it became much more of a hand-in-hand relationship with traditional product management to make sure that started to have an influence on how the backlog took shape. Right.
Okay. And another question, since you're here, I'm really interested in, I've had some good and some bad experiences with project managers in the games industry. I find it a very difficult role to place because as a producer in, say, PC console, you are expected to know a lot about project management, but no one's going to teach you. Mm-hmm. And then in mobile, you have product managers who are whipping the horses going, go, 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 but they seem to be relying on someone like a project manager to keep it all together. Now, what's your opinion about having separate project managers?
I think it depends on the focus, the scale. There's a bunch of different factors in this, right? For a big console AAA type project, I've seen it and have worked in those situations where you have project managers who are in charge of delivery for things. Those project managers are largely divorced from the what they're delivering. They're just focusing on the when and the how the thing gets delivered. It's become increasingly the case, at least in my experience, that the what we deliver is influenced by product managers who don't really care about the how and anything else. So they just care about the when. And so they're, like you say, they are whipping that horse It's got to add their new feature, their new amazing costume they're going to sell to make billions of dollars, etc. And they don't really care about the consequences in terms of the team and the human consequence of what it takes to deliver that. So there is a natural tension between those two roles. For the project manager side, I think that all producers should have an awareness and a keen awareness actually of project management. That doesn't mean they have to be the person managing the project, but I think they should be able to look at any project they're working on, give it a bit of a sniff and see what stinks from a project management perspective. Purely because if we follow the logic that producers are the ones who are ultimately responsible for delivering a thing, they can't just point the finger at a project manager they're working with and be like, well, you didn't tell me the project was going wrong. They should have enough common sense and wherewithal to figure that out for themselves.
I think it's very difficult for a producer to be told, make sure you're doing project management. Because when you look up project management on the web and you go, well, what's project management then? Or if you look at your gaming production experience and you go, well, I guess it's tracking how work's going in Jira, or it's ducking Handsoft up and having a look in there, or it's walking around and making sure people are on track. It's like, no. Project management, just like program management, project management's a really big deal. There's a lot to it. I mean, I've just done some podcasts on risk management because I think it's interesting that people need to understand that it all kind of starts with risk management. You should be assessing your risks and your issues. And as a producer, working around risks and issues is a really big deal, real big part of your job. And that's a small part of project management. Now, I think we're either lucky or we're not. We can, maybe like me, you've worked outside the industry and you've worked as a project manager and as a program manager, and you've got some training and experience. Or like you've just, busted your ass, self-taught, correct me if I'm wrong. And, you've got to where you are because you've put the work in and you've learned that stuff. But I find it very hard. I would find it very difficult to tell a starting producer or a junior producer right now, go off and do that course over there and you'll learn how to be a project manager that works for the games industry. What about you? I mean, what do you...
I totally agree, man. I totally agree. There is no one size fits all producer. So therefore there is no one course you can go on which teaches you everything you need to know to be a project manager for these things or to be a product manager, right? There just isn't. This is why I look at production in some ways as the never ending dream of being great as a producer. Because there'll always be a new skill you can pick up that makes you better in some way. There'll always be a new technique or a new tool you can use which can make you better in terms of what you do. I guess if anything, there are probably some norms or baseline level of skills that I think people can invest in, which help them get not necessarily like good at things, but that kind of common vocabulary or that baseline level of collective understanding about what we mean when we talk about certain things. So things like the product owner training or the Scrum Master training. While not essential, I think doing that is a massive leverage for and force multiplier for producers in terms of them understanding how to work with a team in a kind of proven way. That said, as I commented earlier, I think to an extent following things and processes too much by the book is a dangerous thing, and it doesn't give producers enough room to kind of put their own stamp on things as well. The Scrum Master training in particular, I think was one where when I did that for the first time, it was kind of a real eye-opener for me. And I've actually done the Scrum certification 3 times now through different companies, actually, where the first time I did it, I was like, holy cow, I didn't realize I was doing most of this stuff without realizing that it was a formal thing, right? When I first started doing it, Agile was this kind of weird thing that people had talked about outside of the industry, and it was starting to bleed its way into the games industry. And when I sat and did my first formal recognition of this through the training program, I was really shocked, like, wait a minute, I'm using professional skills in the video game industry. This is weird. I didn't think I was a professional at anything. It felt very odd to have it codified and recognized as a formalized discipline, but also very freeing in a way. It gave me that confidence that I wasn't just winging it or making it up. I was actually doing stuff that proper industry professionals at big technology companies were doing and using. And that was a wonderfully freeing experience to feel like I wasn't having this imposter syndrome you talk about all the time.
That's great. And the way you said that about the codification of the role, I think that's incredibly powerful. I remember going on a Prince 2 course, which is a how to run projects that the UK government publish, and it's terrible. And
honestly, I remember my old EP back at Codemasters telling me this is a thing you have to do. He was ex-MOD Prince 2 certified, wonderful guy. And I got my Prince 2 certification. I ended up finishing it thinking, But if I do all that, I'm not going to have any time to do the project management.
Yeah, I mean, for people who don't know, and I'm sure most of you don't, and why would you? Prince 2 is really for how to project manage things like construction sites and local councils, and it's things like you must all have a risk register. You must keep a log of all incidents that happen on your site, and it's that foundation knowledge of project management that 10 years ago there wasn't really anything else available.
Yeah.
And even now, if you try and look up project management qualifications, the most galling part of it is they will tell you how to pass the project management exam. And unfortunately, some of the agile training is like this, and some of the lean training, they won't tell you what it means. So, I can sit there, and which I've done. I've there's a video on game-production.com where I say, right, let's work through an actual risk register. Let's put together a useful one. Let's actually show you how to do it. That's very rare, because if you were to do a course like the Prince 2 or the American version, which is the Project Management Institute, the PMI, and the PMBOK, which is the Project Management Book of Knowledge, if you were to do all of their exams, etc., it's just a pyramid scheme. It's just taking your money and making you be able to tell people why a risk register, for example, or change management or whatever is a good thing. And
it's Scientology for project managers.
It's awful. But you do them. And the nice thing is, if you've been in the game industry as a producer for a couple of years, Callum's quite right. When you do those sort of exams, and when you do those sort of studies, even if it's self-study, if you go to Udemy and try and do some project management courses, you'll go, oh, okay, so I wasn't far off then. Because a lot of it is common sense, and a lot of it is foundation knowledge, right?
Yeah.
But I'm absolutely desperate that this codification of being a producer that can happen, that people don't have to feel their way in the dark so much and wonder if they're doing it right. I'm desperate for us to just spread knowledge and have a place like this place, but have a place where there's at least a foundation of knowledge where you can come and go, oh, okay, so if I want to be that kind of producer, I should be strong in these areas. Got it.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem to exist anywhere. So,
and that's a real shame, right? I mean, back when we started doing this as producers, there really was only one path. You were this kind of producer because that's all the industry had known. Now that the industry has grown and evolved and it's opened up so many different avenues, I think it's a real confusing shame for anybody who wants to become a game producer that they only really have the producers they've worked with as role models. They don't really have an idea of what exists beyond that game, that project, that company. And every company does this very differently. Every company has a different view of what production is, how that career path grows. And it can be confusing with so much diversification out there to really understand, what are the core skills that are applicable to all of this? What are the specialist skills that only apply to certain parts? And I, for one, I take my digital hat off to you, Liam, for trying to figure out a way of putting some of this down as a resource for people.
But your digital hat was the only thing you were wearing.
Well, yeah. And aren't we glad that I'm not on webcam right now.
So are you bringing back Worlds Adrift?
I cannot comment on that.
Right. Okay, I was told to ask you that.
Yeah, I think if you look at Boss's various different social media channels, it's usually the first question that gets asked whenever we post anything. I would ask any of your listeners who are particularly interested in that to also do the same.
Very well said, sir. Head of production at Boss, what are your 3 biggest headaches and 3 biggest joys?
I'll start with the joys, because I think as producers, sometimes we have a tendency to focus on the negatives. Number one, it's the team I work with. The handful of producers I have there, which range from a senior producer, a regular tier producer, an associate producer, a creative producer, and a technical producer. So there's just 5 examples of different titles for you. They're a wonderful mixture of people. All of them have incredibly different skill sets. My senior producer is, as I put it, one of the best people producers I've ever worked with. He can just lead a team. He can charismatically stand in front of a room full of executives and kind of tell them why they're right or tell them why they're wrong sometimes and just kind of sell things. My producer, she is one of the best what I call project management producers. You throw her into a Jira project and in 30 minutes she'll have figured out 15 different ways that it's inefficient and fixed most of them already. My associate producer that I have is one of the, I guess, rawest talents I've seen in a long time, where he just has common sense in such abundance. I look at him and go, you're either like the smartest person in the room or like the most switched on person in the room. I'm not sure which it is, but you're just damn good at this. So leading that team is an incredible honor for me to do so. Especially considering, talking about imposter syndrome, I look at them sometimes and I'm like, I can learn from you guys, and I love that two-way transactional relationship in terms of information sharing with them. Other joys are, it is quite nice to go back into doing console and PC games back at Bossa. On the flip side, that'll bring me to one of my negatives, which is I have moved away from mobile, which is where I actually feel the industry at large is trending. My third joy would probably be, it's kind of a personal one actually, but it's nice to be back in the UK. I think there's something special about the UK games industry. This is no disrespect to the Helsinki studio. I love being there, and it has its own very special flavor as well. Like the Helsinki Game Dev Studio is very, very close knit. But I guess, having started the industry in 1999 at Codemasters, there is something about that kind of Brit soft developer that you'll see occasionally in game websites, where we are often the plucky underdog of making video games. And I quite like that attitude. So I owe you two more headaches, right? I think I'm working for a company right now that's going through some interesting transitions. Trying to bring in a more standardized way of making video games for them is definitely a headache. Not because they are sort of against this, but because companies get into a rhythm of their business, doing things a certain way and understanding how they operate. Me coming in as head of production and saying, "Hey guys, you've been successful so far, but do you know if you completely change everything you do, you can be even more successful?" It's an interesting message to sell into a company, trying to understand, why not doing pre-production is a bad thing, why doing pre-production is a good thing. There's a lot of education, which is kind of a slow and painful headache that I have to kind of work through.
And of course, change and transition is a slow and painful headache. I mean, you can hire people whose entire job is to try and change something in a big corporation. So the fact you're trying to do that yourself, kudos to you, mate.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. It's honestly, it's been really fun, right? Never been one to shy away from a challenge. And this is actually now the third time that I've designed and built a full end-to-end game development process or framework for the studio to follow. And it's been really interesting. And actually,
but it's only got 3 steps, right?
Yeah, make games, ship games, spend money. That's basically it. Yeah. Actually, the third one, despite everything we've talked about today about product management, the third one is actually not really having that product function. That's my other headache. I've become very aware of how useful it is to think big picture product rather than just individual game features as part of a game. And now working in a company where, through no fault of their own, Bossa hasn't really done this before in terms of being a game that is fully live operations or fully games as a service. It is definitely a different way of thinking, going back to a more old school, box product one and done PC mentality. Something that I'm both enjoying and not enjoying in equal measure.
Yeah, I mean, it's agile. I'm just going to throw in a random comment now. Agile says use agile if your project is particularly complicated. And I look at like making a mobile game and go, this is something very complicated. I look at PC and console and I think you're entering the world of chaos, because what you've done is you've said, make a game which you don't really have to tell anyone what it really is. Do a little quick prototype, and then 2 years later, we'll see where we're at. And I know that's very, very flippant way of expressing it. And I apologize to everybody who doesn't actually do that, because it's not really what happens. But to someone from the outside world, especially from a product manager from the outside world, it can appear that way, right? Because you've made this point earlier, is that you can start off saying, we're going to make this X. And by the time it's shipped and gone through E3, you're on Y, Z, and back on the alphabet again. And I think it's a very difficult. It's a difficult world to be in, right? It's a difficult world that you need to take charge of that thing as a producer, and you need to be able to say, all those promises that we made, all that money that we've spent, all this pressure we're under, we need to get to the other side of this and be making something that people are hopefully going to like. With the other way of doing it, where you're making something and you're getting it in front of people as soon as possible, you don't have that terror, because it's It's there. It's that you're getting feedback straight away. And I don't get why we don't do it that way.
There is in sort of smaller, more bite-sized chunks, right? You're not testing the entire game and going, holy crap, I hope they like this because we spent 3 years making it. You're testing a feature that you've worked on for a couple of months. And if they don't like it, sure, it sucks to throw 2 months worth of work away or to have to go back and refactor it or change it entirely. But it's much, much easier to swallow for a small portion of the team to throw away a small piece of work than an entire game studio to throw away years of work.
Which is why, of course, so many people reduce the risk and make sequels, because you've got a winning formula.
That's for all remasters now. Have you noticed the current trend?
Oh, yeah.
He's doing like the HD remaster of all their old IP classics.
Yeah. Well, I'm a sucker for a remaster, I must say.
Oh, me too. I love playing the same game twice for 3 times the cost. Yeah.
Do you think a successful producer has to be obsessed with games and the games industry?
I don't think they have to. I actually have worked with some very good producers who are not fanatical about video games. However, the kind of work they do as producers is much more the development director, the project manager type producer, etc. And again, this comes back to the diversification of the role. 15 years ago, my answer to that would have emphatically been, yes, of course they do. They have to live and breathe video games. They have to know Mario's middle name and like how many quills are on the back of Sonic the Hedgehog. You know, they've had to live and breathe this. Nowadays, you don't have to. There's a much more accommodating different range of options for you in production. That said, I do live and breathe video games, so I will always have a personal bias towards answering that that's the only way. But like I say, it's not a universal truth. You can find a home if you're not a hardcore gamer these days.
I suppose I agree with you, but I do think, the fact that, we are saying, right, that the production role is an umbrella term for a lot of other things. Mm-hmm. And I think probably some of those other things, you really do need to be a gaming fanatic if you're going to get the respect of your teams. Mm-hmm. And if you want to go in a certain direction, like if you want any kind of creative vision, you probably do need to be a bit of a fanatic, right?
I think so, yeah. I mean, you can look at it in the sense of, if you are fanatical about games, you can learn project management skills, or you can learn some of the hard skills that other disciplines in production will need. You can't really teach a passion for something. It's either there or it isn't. I mean, yeah, you can get more acclimatized to something over the years. But I think truly passionate people, for them, it's in their DNA, right? It's in their core of who they are. You can't really teach that. So not having it will limit some of the options available to you. Like, I can't imagine an executive producer who doesn't like video games. Like, they're in it just purely for the satisfaction of making great projects. That doesn't strike me as a thing that should really exist. But yeah, like I say, doesn't mean that you have to be a person who goes home after working on games for 8 hours a day and spends 8 hours a day playing video games in their evenings. That doesn't have to be the case.
It is in your case, obviously.
Yeah, yeah, basically, yes. I mean, as soon as we finish this, I'm going to go and play some more video games.
What are you playing? I must ask.
You might remember from our time together at Wargaming, Liam, I'm a bit of a Warhammer fanatic. Mm-hmm. So I'm currently working my way through a game called Warhammer 40,000 Mechanicus. It's kind of a strategy-based game where you play as the Adeptus Mechanicus against the Necrons, 2 factions that I have a painted tabletop army to play with as well. So I'm currently going through that because yesterday Games Workshop announced a new version of Warhammer 40,000 coming. So it lit my nostalgia fire. So I'm going to go through and play Mechanicus again. I've played it for a couple of times, and yeah, 3rd time's the charm.
I played some old Space Marine games a few months ago, so I it's a nice place to go back to.
There is something wonderful about going back to the old analog games, as I like to call them. None of this digital stuff, just rolling some dice and moving some plastic.
If you're a college student and you're thinking, I'm going to have a look at becoming a games producer, that sounds really interesting. I could one day head up my own studio or something. Brilliant. What advice would you give them? And what advice wouldn't you give them?
The advice I would give them would be, as much as it's hard to do, really do your homework on what goes into making a video game, right? Ultimately, producers are responsible for bringing together a lot of very talented, different skill set people to try and achieve the impossible, to try and make a bunch of zeros and ones turn into things that capture the emotions of the people playing them. So understand as much as you can, or as much as you feel you need to, around how people build 3D models, how they concept test the art, how a game engine works, how the programming works. You don't have to be able to do it, but you should understand that there are people who do that, and that it's a very specialist skill, and understand what it takes to be part of that skill set. What advice would I not give to someone is, don't get too obsessed about Don't get too obsessed about trying to read every article there is on the internet, about trying to listen to every talk. There's a lot of misinformation out there about game production, which is why I respect so much what you're doing, Liam, trying to debunk some of the myths around this. I would suggest, don't go down the rabbit hole of Googling what is a game producer, because it is now so diversified. You'll get 1,000 different answers. Find a couple of sources of truth that you feel are credible, and stick with those as your entry point into the industry.
That's good advice. The Wikipedia on game production, by the way, entry is appalling.
Yeah, it's so hilariously just like out of date. I want to go in there and do some citations at some point.
But do you know what stunned me is that amongst the thousands of game producers in the world, no one's gone in and changed it. I mean, that just goes to show what a non-community we all are.
This is a very
all working in isolation.
We aren't a particularly community-based bunch of people, which is odd considering a lot of our job is about communication and bringing people together.
Yes. Well, I take you back to the imposter syndrome, in which everyone's too scared to talk to each other in case they work out they've been doing it all wrong.
Or if I'm going to be positive, too busy to find time to make a community.
Yeah, that's not true.
No.
So, okay. So, thank you very much. I think I should stop, right? Because it's been a very long chat, and I don't want to exhaust you. But I guess if I'm going to exhaust you, the one final question I would ask you would be just about, did you have a clear career path in mind when you started off on your path as a producer? Was there a big dream already in your head?
I mean, not in any kind of tangible way when I first started. As I mentioned earlier in the conversation, the first I really got into the video game industry was by accident. Went for a summer job and very much just kind of stuck around. And I've always had a deep love of video games, so it felt like a natural fit for me from day one. When I first realized I wanted to go into production, with the ultimate goal for me, hopefully being to run my own startup studio one day. That's a thing I'm still working towards. It was when I actually sat and worked in external publishing back in Codemasters, getting the opportunity to go and see many, many different studios and realizing that there is no template for how you set up a game studio. There's no template for the kind of people you hire. It's that wonderful, organic, just throwing together different people, different backgrounds, different elements, and trying to shape and mold it into something that really works for each individual studio as an individual entity in its own right. I just got very excited around the fact that this could be a thing where it didn't have a right or a wrong answer. It could be so organic and it could be so individualized. I really, 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 really enjoyed that and wanted that to become, I guess, an endpoint for me. So I guess I've known that I wanted to become a studio head of my own studio for probably the last 15 years, but it took me the first 4 or 5 years of really working in game production to realize that was where I was ultimately aiming at. I think I may have subconsciously been steering myself towards that during those 4 or 5 years, having been influenced by some great studio leads at that time. But it wasn't really until I moved from Codemasters to Activision that I realized, holy crap, I know now what I want to do.
Do you know what kind of games you would like to make and what kind of platforms they'd be on?
I would definitely want to move back into mobile, partly because as a producer, one of the things that excites me is that honest transaction with the users, like I talked about, but also I really just want to cut down the inefficiencies, the waste, the incredible sort of largesse that comes with console and PC, where we are a little bit too opulent, a little bit too self-indulgent. I just want to make really fun, very accessible, deep, rich, rewarding, metagame-driven mobile games that rely on a very simple, repeatable core. I think simple, repeatable core game mechanics actually exist in console as well, but they gild the lily a lot. But simple things like aim, shoot, move, reload, those kind of simple core loop mechanics in things like Call of Duty. Yeah, we window dress them around a whole big storyline and massive cinematic explosions, but that core moment is infinitely repeatable. And I think that must be able to be something that we can translate across to different devices and different platforms, and then bring the kind of the real deep metagame progression, that drop in, drop out, bite size, but always persistent meta progression from mobile. That's where I see my future, I think.
That's lovely that you have a vision of your future like that. And I think just from talking to you, and I think everyone listening would agree that I think you're going to be successful, man. You've got that passion, but more to the point, you've suffered. you've done the producer suffering.
I've suffered my art, darlings. Yes.
Thank you, Callum. If there was a question that you had wished I'd asked you, do tell me, and I can ask it.
That's a very good one. So I wish you had asked, how essential is it that producers have budgetary responsibility? Because this is a thing that back in my day, Liam, all producers own budgets. Recently, when I've been talking to producers, none of them own budgets, and it's a real interesting, odd divergence in the skill set I'm seeing, where a lot of producers aren't aware of the cost that goes into making a video game anymore. And if we think back to that old project management triangle of time, quality, and budget, if you aren't aware of the budget, how can you ever really be aware of what you're making and if it's good value for money?
Even outside of the games industry, I've worked in places where project managers have no visibility on their budgets, and any kind of project management in which you don't have that part of the project management triangle ready to your hand to be able to talk through and discuss. And you can't then talk about things like value, can you? You can't talk about cost. You don't know anything, and it's. Why do you think that is? Do you think that's jealously guarded by those above, like dev directors, etc.? Do you think that's the problem? I
think it has very much become the remit of a smaller circle of more self-important people, perhaps, in team makeups. I think there's also an element of not wanting to worry slightly less experienced people in the teams now, with seeing the overall big picture of what the cost looks like. But I can't see why that should or would be the case. I mean, I think if we're going to be good producers, we have to be consciously aware that spending £5 million on making a particular game, or a feature in a game in some cases, that is kind of 95% quality is not better than spending, a fraction of that to get to 80% quality. It comes back to the MVP model and getting things in the hands of users at the right time. You can't really know if you're getting MVP unless you know what the V is, the value.
And I think with metrics, KPIs, etc., in which it's all about, it's not all about, but a lot of it is about money. It makes no sense at all to not give a producer, a product manager, whoever, to not empower them to be able to make more money for you, to reduce your costs, or to make the case of needing more money in order to bring a great deal more value. And hiding all of that doesn't even give them the exposure to be able to have the discussion, does it?
Exactly. And I think, if anything, I find it much, much harder now when I'm talking to new producers or people who are kind of a couple of years into this career path and telling them that I have an expectation they'll do budget management, because that's not a thing that they are expecting out of the production role. I think it surprises them when I have that expectation for them.
It's a great point. And I think, if I think about things like external producers who work for publishers, they're probably exposed a lot more to things like the finance and the financial aspects of the game, right? But it's not just financial. There's things like legal, licensing, localization, etc. A huge world of almost check boxes that they have to go through to get games out there, etc. And which, if you're just a lonely producer looking after a few teams as part of a larger game, and no one even thinks that you should be exposed to that, and you're never going to learn about it. But then if you get promoted to a senior producer, you'll suddenly be put in charge of it, potentially.
Indeed.
Right?
Indeed. And honestly, I look at it as a double-edged sword. I think back to some of my early games where I was doing budget management and some projects I was working on, it would almost be 2 or 3 days a month I would spend in a spreadsheet, doing the differences between the actuals and my forecast that came in and working what that did to my overall budget costs, my contingency. It was a laborious headache, but it gave me a real appreciation that every single action we choose to take in a game comes at a cost.
Yeah. Since we're still talking, when I was at Sony PlayStation and I was put in charge of PlayStation Home and given budget responsibility, or at least it was kind of responsibility. It was enough responsibility. I was working with my senior director and we would work through these budgets. And what was hilarious about them is, firstly, they would get translated into dollars from pounds, and then they would get translated into the yen, Japanese yen, because it's Sony. And depending upon exchange rate changes every quarter, that would completely change your budget by hundreds of thousands of pounds. So if you suddenly had £100,000 less, you began a little sad journey of looking at it and going, well, hang on, 100,000 is what? Let's say it's between 10 and 15,000 a month, depending upon where you are, how much somebody's wages, if you include everything. That could be 10 people's jobs, right?
Yeah.
But then you look at it and go, well, I'll tell you what, it means that we're not going to go to E3 this year because that's pretty expensive, right? We might save 50 grand doing that, cutting out some of that stuff. And you begin to realize even things like somebody wants some licenses, somebody wants some computers, somebody needs some hardware, software, whatever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Everything, OPEX, CAPEX, the lot, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think without understanding the raw costs of what it takes to make a game, you get detached from it. You can actually quite easily get into just a vicious circle of being like, oh, we'll iterate a bit longer. Oh, we'll spend a bit more time on this. It doesn't really give you the grounding or the understanding or the context for making the right choices as a producer sometimes.
I remember making a massive cock up where there was this art freelancer bloke who was being paid bugger all. And I very kindly went, do you know what? He's doing a great job. Let's put his wage up by 100 quid a day. Because what's 100 quid? And then I worked it out what 100 quid was at like around 22 days a month. And so I've just given him 2,200 more. And then I multiplied that. Went, holy shit. So I've just spent over 24 grand with one decision.
Yeah.
Where am I going to find that money from? And you can, I think that's where I got interested in things like lean waste reduction, where you're trying to squeeze out the waste of not just money, but time really, and blockages and things like that, and make everything as efficient as possible. And you guys, any of you who play strategic war games on computer or Civilization or anything, how important these little drops of energy are, and what you do with them and where you spend them and how that's going to affect your future. Now, I think that's a great point. That's a question I should have asked you. I will add to my list of having budget responsibilities, or at least awareness, right? At least
exactly. Knowing what it costs rather than necessarily having to be responsible for it. I think that's a really important fundamental skill for most people in the production mindset.
What's your hugest budget cock-up?
My hugest budget cock-up is working on a licensed racing game with a bunch of different car manufacturers where they all had different royalties they would want on the back end to try and incentivize them to be part of the game and cut down the upfront cost we had to pay to use their car licenses. Through just sort of sheer tiredness and long hours at the time on a project that was particularly difficult, ended up building a budget which wrongly allocated the royalty percentage to the different car manufacturers. And in this budget, no one had actually caught this because I'd kind of built this model myself. No one had caught this and ended up realizing that I was off by about $15 million, making the game look more positive as an ROI than perhaps it should have done. And then went to the next green light rather sheepishly going, so I screwed up. And when I presented the budget last time, I thought we'd make this much money. Actually, when I look at the royalty deals we've struck, we're actually going to make 15 million less. Really, really sorry. Don't fire me.
And then you move to your next job.
Actually, no, I saw that project out in the end, but it was a very hairy green light meeting. I could feel some very rich people staring at me with angry eyes.
It probably helps they were already rich.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, it's not like I'd lost them. It's because they were making less millions than they thought they would.
Well, that is a big cock up. Congratulations. Thank you for admitting it. I think that will give people a lot of confidence.
Thanks.
So thanks, Callum. I really appreciate this. We need to talk more. It'd be great to get some feedback from people if they want to ask you any more questions. And when I put this up, please do ask anything you like on the comment section, and we can come back to Callum. And you've already said that you'll come back and talk some more. So thank you.
It's been a real pleasure talking to you today, Liam. It's been wonderful to catch up, and I really hope that your listeners get a kick out of learning about my unique, hopefully, perspective on game production.
Thanks for listening. As always, we really appreciate your thoughts and feedback about the show. You can reach out to us by visiting game-production.com's podcast pages and leaving comments under each episode. We have a Facebook group and YouTube channel that you can find linked from the website. If you want to contribute or fancy a chat in the future, we'd love to hear from you.